The scorching sun of the Arizona desert gleamed on Sheriff John Cooper's golden badge, reflecting the seriousness in his gaze. In Cottonwood Creek, a town where dust and silence were broken only by the creak of the wind and the occasional jingle of spurs, John was more than just an authority figure. He was the rock, the pillar of a community that saw him as a symbol of unwavering justice. 30 years ago, he swore to protect those open fields and the souls that lived within them, and he had never hesitated. His life was dedicated to the law, a code of honor he followed with the same devotion with which he had loved his late wife, Sarah. Sheriff John was a man of few words, but his once gentle blue eyes now carried the weight of deep sorrow. Sarah's death, 5 years earlier, had left a hole in his chest that not even the relentless routine of duty could fill. His only son, Ethan Cooper, was the last living reminder of his love for Sarah. Ethan, a young man in his 20s, had always been a free spirit, a bit rebellious, but John always saw him through the proud eyes of a father, with the hope that one day he'd find his path and perhaps follow in his footsteps, or at least those of the law. However, in recent months, a dark shadow had fallen over Cottonwood Creek. A gang of outlaws known only as the Dust Nomads had been terrorizing the small towns of the region. Cattle thefts, bank robberies, and even brutal murders had left behind a trail of fear and panic. Hunting down these criminals became John's top priority. He spent sleepless nights chasing leads, interrogating suspects, and growing increasingly frustrated with each dead end. With every attack, the pressure on John mounted. The people of Cottonwood Creek, who once trusted him blindly, began to wonder why their capable sheriff couldn't stop this new threat. The conflict was clear. The town's order and John's reputation hinged on capturing the Dust Nomads, and he would do anything to bring them to justice. The hunt for the Dust Nomads consumed John. Every fragment of information, every whisper in a saloon, was meticulously analyzed. He spent countless hours in his office, his time-worn hands tracing faded maps of the region, marking attack sites and probable escape routes. Deputy Billy Joe, his right-hand man for over a decade, watched his sheriff's relentless dedication with a mix of admiration and concern. Billy Joe, a sturdy man with a thick mustache and an easy sense of humor, was the perfect counterbalance to John's stern nature, but even he could feel the gravity of the situation. "John, you need to rest. You're looking like a ghost," Billy Joe said one night, finding the sheriff slumped over his desk, the oil lamp casting dancing shadows across his tired face. John just grunted, eyes still fixed on a torn map. "I can't rest while those worms are still out there, Billy. They're getting too bold." The Nomads' boldness indeed knew no bounds. A few weeks later, a violent attack occurred at the Miller family ranch, a well-known and respected household. The cattle were stolen, and the patriarch, Hank Miller, was severely injured. The brutality of the attack shocked the entire town, and the pressure on John became unbearable. The once subtle glances of doubt from citizens were now open stares of desperation. He felt the weight of each gaze, the mistrust corroding his reputation. Clues were scarce and conflicting. Witnesses described the Nomads as masked figures, fast and efficient. The only consistent detail was the gang leader, a tall man with a distinctive scar on his chin and a strange wild rose tattoo on his forearm. John etched these details in his mind with cold determination. He knew that capturing the leader was key to dismantling the entire operation. During an investigation of a freight train robbery a few miles from Cottonwood Creek, John found a clue that didn't fit. Among the wreckage and hoofprints there was a richly embroidered blue silk handkerchief bearing the initials EC. John's heart skipped a beat. Those were the initials of his son, Ethan Cooper. A chill ran through his veins, but he quickly dismissed the thought. Coincidence, he told himself. Plenty of folks around here have those initials. But the coincidence became a haunting specter. Days later, While interrogating a reluctant informant at a saloon in Last Chance Gulch, John heard something that made him stagger. The informant, an old drunk named Silas, hesitated before whispering, "The leader. The leader's got that tattoo, and they say he sounds just like the sheriff's boy." Silas coughed and backed away, frightened by the frozen expression on John's face, the tattoo, the voice, and now the initials on the handkerchief. A mountain of evidence began to form, and each piece pointed to an unthinkable truth. John tried to reject the idea, his mind screaming that it was a mistake, an impossibility. His son couldn't be a criminal. But the sheriff in him couldn't ignore the evidence piling up in such a disturbing way. He had to confront Ethan. He needed the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The truth, cold and sharp as a blade, struck John with devastating force. He was at the old family hunting cabin, a place of tender memories now tainted by suspicion. He had invited Ethan there for a conversation, a meeting that seemed innocent, but which John felt was a prelude to despair. The air was heavy with unspoken tension. Ethan, with eyes identical to his mother's, seemed uneasy, averting his gaze at each of his father's questions. "Ethan, son, I need to know," John began, his voice hoarse, struggling to remain composed. "You've been absent. Things are happening around here, and I need you to be honest with me. Are you involved with this gang, the Dust Nomads?" Ethan swallowed hard, eyes fixed on the wooden floor. Silence stretched, and each second was an eternity for John. Then, Ethan raised his head. There was no fear in his eyes, but rather a mix of defiance and resignation. He rolled up his sleeve, revealing the wild rose tattoo on his forearm. The same one the informant had described. "Yes, Dad," Ethan said, his voice surprisingly steady. "I'm the leader. I'm the nomad." Those words pierced John's heart. They echoed through the cabin like a gunshot. The pain was physical, as if the air had been sucked from his lungs. He staggered, hands trembling, grabbing the edge of the table. The image of his son, the boy he had taught to fish and shoot, was now the very figure who had been terrorizing the region. "Why, Ethan? For God's sake, why?" John barely managed to whisper. The disappointment coursed through his veins like poison. Ethan laughed a bitter, hollow laugh. "Why? Because life in Cottonwood Creek isn't the paradise you paint it to be, Dad. It's a prison. I wanted more. I wanted freedom, money, respect. The rules you live by, they're not for me, and these nomads. They gave me all that." The revelation was an earthquake. Sheriff John Cooper, the man who upheld the law above all else, was now face to face with his own son, the outlaw he had sworn to bring to justice. The confrontation was inevitable. Loyalty to blood and duty to the law collided in the most brutal way. John felt the weight of his badge, which once gave him strength, now crushing him. He stood at a painful crossroads: arrest his own son or betray everything he had ever believed in. The decision would be the hardest of his life, and the consequences would be irreversible. Life, as John knew it, had just crumbled. The revelation weighed on John like a mountain of stones. In the days following the confrontation at the cabin, he isolated himself in his office, curtains drawn, the silence broken only by the creak of his chair and the occasional clink of a whiskey glass. The entire town seemed suspended in tense anticipation, sensing that something had changed, though they didn't know what. Billy Joe tried to reach out several times, offering coffee or just a friendly shoulder, but John remained distant. His paint a wall no one could cross. The decision was agonizing. Arresting Ethan meant destroying what was left of his family, dishonoring Sarah's legacy, and staining the memory of a son he had raised with so much love. But not arresting him meant betraying his oath, his town, and himself. It was a war inside him, between the father and the sheriff was feeling increasingly cornered. One night, after hours of silent contemplation, John stood up abruptly. He walked to the window and threw open the curtains, letting the moonlight flood the room. His eyes, once clouded with pain, now held a grim determination. He remembered Sarah's words from long ago about the importance of doing what's right, even when it's the hardest thing. "Justice doesn't choose sides, John. It simply is," she used to say, with a gentle smile. John's mind cleared. His duty wasn't to blood, it was to the law. The choice, though excruciating, was clear. He was the sheriff of Cottonwood Creek. Ethan had made his choices, and now he would have to face the consequences. John knew this decision would change him forever. He would lose his son in a way that Sarah's death never did. But he also knew that by doing the right thing, he would honor her memory and preserve the integrity he had always stood for. From that moment, John began planning his strategy. He knew that capturing Ethan as leader of the Dust Nomads would be no easy task. He knew his son's tricks, his escape routes, his hideouts. What had once been an advantage in parenting now became a weapon in the hunt. John began studying each map with renewed purpose, analyzing every move the Nomads made with the eyes of someone who understood the leader's mind. He asked Billy Joe to gather the best scouts and to keep the operation confidential without revealing the urgency. Behind it, it was a personal manhunt with consequences for the entire region. Sheriff John Cooper was ready to do the unthinkable in the name of justice. The final hunt began on a moonless night, the desert darkness swallowing the jagged outlines of the Iowa Mountains. John, leading a small group of his best deputies, including Billy Joe, moved like a silent shadow. They had tracked the Dust Nomads to an isolated canyon, a maze of red rock where the gang was camped, preparing for what would be their final major heist. John's plan was simple, yet risky: a surprise attack at dawn when the gang would be in their deepest sleep. The tension was almost tangible as they crept closer. Every sound, the crunch of a boot in the sand, the rustle of wind through the cacti, seemed amplified in the night's stillness. John felt his heart pounding, a mix of adrenaline and the piercing pain of what was about to unfold. At daybreak, as the first rays of sunlight painted the sky orange and violet, John gave the signal. The ambush was flawless. The deputies, trained for precision, moved swiftly. Gunshots echoed through the canyon, and chaos erupted in the Nomads' camp. Horses neighed, men shouted, and the acrid scent of gunpowder filled the air. John, revolver in hand, moved with the precision of a seasoned predator. He took down 2 gang members before spotting his target. Ethan, the young man, his face hidden behind a scarf to conceal the scar, but with the wild rose tattoo visible on his arm, fought with the ferocity of a cornered wolf. He barked orders, trying to rally his men. Their eyes met in the midst of the chaos. Time froze. There was no hatred in Ethan's gaze, only a grim understanding and a flicker of sorrow. The leader's mask slipped, revealing the son John once knew. "Ethan!" John shouted, his voice thick with emotion but resolute. "Surrender! It's over!" Ethan hesitated, eyes scanning the scene, realizing defeat was inevitable. He could have run, but something in his expression told John that he knew there was nowhere left to go. Slowly, he lowered his weapon. That's when one of the Dust Nomads, a large, wild-eyed man, realized his leader was giving up. Fueled by desperation, the man raised a knife and charged at John in a suicidal frenzy. Billy Joe, standing near the sheriff, reacted on instinct. He fired his gun. The shot, meant for the attacker, ricocheted off a nearby rock and, in a cruel twist of fate, struck Ethan in the shoulder. Ethan collapsed with a groan, surprise replacing resignation on his face. John rushed to him, dropping to his knees beside his son. Blood stained the dust beneath them, and Ethan's eyes locked onto his father's with pain and a strange final peace. Double quotes. "Dad. Ethan whispered, voice frail, his wounded hand reaching for John's badge. I get it. You had to." The words faded. Ethan's eyes closed, his breathing shallow. John held him tightly, feeling the warmth of the blood slipping away, and a cry of anguish tore through the canyon, a raw sound that spoke of a father's unbearable pain as he watched his son be taken by the very life he had chosen. The silence that followed Ethan's final breath was more deafening than any gunfight. The dust settled, and the canyon became a tableau of grief and ruin. John remained on his knees, cradling his son's lifeless body, the sheriff's badge gleaming against the dark red of Ethan's blood-stained shirt. Billy Joe approached slowly, his face pale and stunned, gun still smoking in his hand. He had no words, only the crushing weight of the tragedy they had just witnessed. The deputies, having seen it all, looked away out of respect for their sheriff's unspeakable sorrow. The remaining Dust Nomads were quickly subdued and handcuffed. The gang was dismantled, the threat finally extinguished. But the victory felt hollow, tasteless. John felt a deeper void than the one left by Sarah's death. He had done his duty, made the right choice, but the cost had been devastating. The news of Ethan's death and the arrest of the Dust Nomads spread through Cottonwood Creek like wildfire. The town was in shock. Some felt relief that the terror was over, but the tragic irony, the sheriff capturing and ultimately losing his own son, weighed heavily on everyone. Ethan's burial was a somber affair. Few attended, but John stood there, alone, before a freshly dug grave, feeling the heavy stares of the small community. Words of comfort felt meaningless in the face of such loss. In the days that followed, John continued to fulfill his duties as sheriff, but something within him had shifted. The light in his eyes had gone out completely, replaced by a deep melancholy. He became more withdrawn, burying himself in work as a way to escape the painful reality. His conversations with Billy Joe became brief and strictly professional. The warmth, the human touch that had once defined him, had vanished. He had saved the town, but at what cost? The silence of the night in his office was filled with memories of a son he had loved and lost in a way that defied understanding. Justice had been served, but Sheriff John Cooper's soul had been irreparably shattered. 2 years had passed since that fateful morning in the Io Canyon. Cottonwood Creek, once plagued by fear, had found peace. The Dust Nomads were now just a distant memory, a dark legend whispered on cold nights. The town's wounds had started to heal, but John Cooper's had not. He remained sheriff, his imposing presence a constant reminder of the law. His face, carved by deep lines and a hollow gaze, told the story of a war fought not just against crime, but within himself. He had brought the outlaws to justice, testifying at each trial with mechanical precision, void of visible emotion. Town respected him even more for what they perceived as strength, unaware that beneath the steel exterior, a man was falling apart. Billy Joe, the ever-faithful deputy, had become the real backbone of the sheriff's office, taking on many of the duties John could no longer bring himself to perform. He watched his friend with quiet sadness, knowing John's pain was a burden no one else could carry. During his rare moments of free time, John would visit the cemetery not to stand